Hey everybody, this is Chris, and in this short video I want to show you how to make this JavaScript animation. In this animation we're going to be using what I call vanilla JavaScript. That means pure JavaScript, no JS libraries. We're going to be using object-oriented programming. We'll be using a constructor to make a bubble object so that we can have lots of bubbles on the screen like you've seen here. We're also going to use arrays. We will store all our bubbles in an array. And on top of all that, we're going to be using the basic or simple game engine that uses request animation frame, which I introduced in a previous video. So if you need to understand a bit more about that, go back and watch that video. Alrighty, so we're going to get started. I'm using brackets, and I'm going to go over here. Actually, I'm going to go right here to my desktop and go ahead and make a new folder, and I'm going to call it bubble animation. We'll store our files there. Let's go back to brackets. In here we're going to go ahead and make a new HTML document. Let's go ahead and save it as bubble animation and go to the desktop and find that folder that I just created. Make sure that we're saving this as a .html file. Alright, we have a blank document. Because I've installed Emmet as an extension here in brackets, all I have to do is press exclamation point, tab, and it will add the basic structure of an HTML page. So we've got that. I'm going to go ahead and call this bubble animation. Inside the body tag, we need to add our canvas tag. And all we need on that is an ID of my canvas. You can give it any name you want, but that works for me. Once we have the canvas, I like to add a little bit of styling to the page so that we can control the layout and the look of the canvas. So right up here in the head area, I'm going to add a style tag. And in there, a body selector. All I want to do is set the margin to 0, padding to 0, and overflow to hidden. That'll do it. Alright, the one last thing we need to do to get our HTML page ready to go is we need to add a script tag so that we can connect to our JavaScript, which we haven't created that file yet, but we're gonna. So let's call the file we're going to use scripts.js. It's going to be in the same folder that we're currently saving this file in, and so we can simply put the name of the file right there. All right, that's all we have to do. Maybe a little bit more in the body. I think you saw in the file example I showed you, I had a little H1 here that simply said animated bubbles. Not necessary to do that, but there you go. If I take a look at this file real quick, if I click the live preview button here in the upper right corner, a browser window will open. Here's what our page looks like so far. Let's go back to brackets. Alright, we've created our HTML page. Now we just need to create our JavaScript file. Let's go File, New. And we'll go ahead and save this into our desktop bubble animation folder, calling this scripts.js. That's all it takes. Alright. One thing I like to do just to demonstrate how you might test a JavaScript file, we can go ahead here and put at the very first line of this page console.log, and just put the word test in there, and save this, and then going back to our HTML file that we've already opened, if we open up the console with F12, we can see that the word test here is displaying in the console because that is coming from the JavaScript file. So now we know that our JavaScript and our HTML files are linked properly and they're communicating with one another, so to speak. Press F12 to close that window. Back to brackets. Alright, we don't really need that, so we'll get rid of that now. First thing we're going to do here in our JavaScript file is set up our canvas variables. Whenever we use a canvas object on a page, we need to create canvas variables that communicate or connect the JavaScript to the page. We need to use the document.getElementById method and give it the name of that canvas, which we just created with the ID of my canvas. There is another way to get the canvas element. You can also go var canvas gets document.query selector. And by doing that, this method looks at the document and looks for any selectors of a certain type. And so you have to provide, in quotes here as a string, the type of element that it is. In this case, it would be a canvas element. And you can do that. These two lines will basically result in the same thing. So you choose one or the other. I'll leave that there as an example, but we're going to go ahead and use the getElementById. All right, we now have our canvas object there saved as a canvas variable. Now we're going to create another variable called C. We do this in all of our JavaScript files that use a canvas. I like to just use C. It's nice and short. Canvas.getContext, and in there we're just going to say we need to get the 2D drawing context. All of that will be saved in C. C becomes our paintbrush that we can now use to draw on the canvas. I'll also like to set the width of the canvas. Canvas.width gets window.inner width, and the canvas.height gets window.inner height, and that will now set our canvas to the same size as the browser window. The next thing we want to do here is actually create a little bubble constructor and create all the code that will actually create our little bubble as it animates across the screen. As you can remember, it's just a circle, blue circle. So I'm going to come down here and create a function, and let's call it bubble. Now I will start the name of this function with a capital B. Normally you do not, but because this is a constructor, okay, for the bubble object, typically in this case you do start it with a capital letter. So function bubble. This particular function, we're going to need it to have a number of arguments. We want to be able to pass in the x location, the y location, the radius, the velocity on the x-axis, and the velocity on the y-axis, so that we can actually move the bubble. Inside this, now then, since we have these arguments being passed in, we'll use this variable to set up each of these as instance variables of this object. This x then will be given the value of x. Y will be given the value. This dot y will give the value of y that's being passed in. This dot r will be given the value of r as passed in. You get the idea. This dot velocity x given the value of vx, and this dot vy is given the value of vy. This is if you're familiar with other object-oriented languages, this is how we set up our object when we first create it. We take the arguments via the argument string, and we initialize all of our instance variables. Our instance variables there start with the word this, the keyword this. A couple more things we can do here. We're going to set the color. In this case, let's go ahead and set it to blue. Now that was not passed in via an argument string. We don't have to do it that way. In this case, we're just going to set all the bubbles to be blue. And now we also want to set up a method or a function that is unique to these objects, and that's going to be the draw method. This dot draw, and we have to set it up as a function, basically a function within this constructor. the first thing we want to do is draw the basic shape of the bubble, and we'll just start using our C variable here. We're going to use the color instance variable that we set up above for drawing that. We have to use the arc command, which takes 5 or 6 arguments. In this case, we'll use these instance variables that we've already created. We need an X and a Y and a radius, a start angle, which is always 0 or usually 0, and then 2 times math.pi will give us a full circle. We can also put false for the anti-clockwise argument, and that it will draw a circle. We need to now fill the circle, and once we've done that, we've finished drawing our circle. We can close path. After we do this, just to make it a little fancy, we're going to draw a little shine dot on the bubble. You'll see that in a little bit, what I mean by that. So we're basically going to draw another circle that uses the coordinates or the arguments that were passed in, the x, y, radius, and all that, vx, vy, from the previous circles, but we're going to just make them 1/3 smaller. A lot of this can actually be copied, so let's take all of this, Control C, and paste this in here. Add a little space at the bottom so we can see this. And now we will, instead of drawing it with the same color that we drew earlier, we'll just say the fill style here will be light blue. X and Y will be a little bit different. We'll take the X, the original X value, and subtract the radius divided by 3. Similarly with the Y, we will take that and subtract radius divided by 1/3 again. Take the radius, simply divide it by 3, and then everything else stays the same. The start angle, the end angle, and anti-clockwise for the circle. We fill that, close the path, and we should have a circle that's about 1/3 size smaller that's drawn right on top of the other circle in light blue. All right. So that's our constructor for how we're going to make a bubble. And it contains all these instance variables and this one method called draw. Why don't we test this bubble constructor now? If this is working properly, we should be able to just draw a simple bubble right on the canvas. So what we'll do is go up here just above this constructor, here on line 9 or so, and test the bubble. What we need to do is just create a temporary variable b and instantiate a new object, a new bubble object. So we use the keyword new, var b gets new bubble. When we create a new bubble, we have to pass in those arguments before. So we'll go x 100, y 100, radius of 20, velocity on the x-axis of 0. We don't want it to move right or left, and a negative y velocity. It's actually not going to move at this point because we haven't gotten to that part, but we have to put those arguments in there, so that'll work. We've created a new bubble. Now we're just going to go ahead and use that bubble instance object b and call its draw method. Now if we've done this all correctly, we should be able now to just go over and look at our canvas, and we can see, voila, we have one bubble drawn on the canvas, 100 pixels over, 100 pixels down, and it looks exactly as we expected. A blue circle with another light blue circle here, a third of the way smaller and kind of up towards the upper left corner. Alrighty, so we've tested this. Now we're going to comment these 2 lines out because they're just really there to test our code, make sure it's working, and we know it is now. Now that we have our bubble constructor and we know that it works, we want to create another method here just after our bubble constructor, and we're going to call it create bubble. Doesn't require any arguments, I need to add a little space here to the bottom of that page so we can move this up the screen a little bit. All right. So we have this new function called create bubble. And this, the reason we need this is, again, we don't want every bubble when we create it to be in the exact same position, same radius, etc. So this function will be used to randomize the size, location, and velocity of each new bubble as we create it. And so let's do something like this. We're going to go ahead and create inside here a var r, which is going to stand for our random radius. We're going to use math.floor, which gives us whole numbers. And inside that, we're going to call math.random, which we know gives us decimal numbers between 0 and up to, but not including 1. We're going to take math.random, and since we want about, or excuse me, if we want a radius between about 10 and 40 pixels in radius, we know that 10 to 40 is about 30 numbers. So when we know that, we multiply this by one more than the number we want. So we want 30, so we multiply by 31, and then we take the result of that and we add, in this case, 10 to that. By doing that, that will give us from 10 to 40 instead of from 0 to 30. Put a comment here that this is giving us from 10 to 40. So we have a random radius. We also need a random location on the x-axis. Similarly, math.random. And we're going to go ahead and well, we're going to multiply by the width of the canvas. Okay, now I just realized that I didn't create that variable yet. So let's just stop here for a second and go back up to where all our variables are up at the top. Okay, we had our canvas height and width, but one other thing I want to do is create var w and give it the value of our canvas.width, and similarly var h, give it the value of our canvas.height. Now, I don't have to do that. I could just use canvas.width, canvas.height everywhere I want to use that, but I find that's a little bit cumbersome. I like to have nice short variable names, so let's use w and h for that. Go ahead down here now. Now this will work. Okay, so basically we're setting the x value, or the location of the bubble, on the x-axis. We're setting it at a random value between 0 and up to, but not including the width of the canvas. So however big the canvas is, now we can place bubbles anywhere on that, on the x-axis, from left to right. Similarly, var y, we're going to go ahead and set that to math.random and multiply that by our h variable, which we just created up above. We also need some velocity variables, and we want to randomize those as well. So var vx, so velocity on the x-axis, we can give that math.random times 4, so it'll give us from 0 to 3, but then we want to also take that, the result of that, and subtract 2 from that. That will actually give us a random number from -2 to 2, because sometimes we want the bubbles to kind of float towards the left, and sometimes kind of float to the right. If they're floating towards the left, they're going in a negative direction. If they're floating to the right, they're going in a positive. So these are pretty small numbers, but they're basically any set of random numbers from -2 to 2. And that seems like that would be about right. Let's go ahead and copy this line, and we're going to do something similar here, but on our velocity on the y-axis, we want to get a random number. Now, we'll say a random number. I played around with these numbers to get what I wanted in terms of the look. You can do the same and change these as you see fit. Now, in this case, I really always want the bubbles to be moving up on the canvas and not down. And if you understand the canvas origin, 0, 0 in the upper left corner, we know that if something's moving upwards on the canvas, it's moving in a negative direction. So what we need to do here, we can just simply come out here and put and negate whatever value we're getting from this random number generator. And that way it'll go up, which is what we want. All right, we're getting there, folks. We're getting there. All right, so now we have the ability to create bubbles randomly around the screen. Well, at least we've created the variables that allow us to randomize that. But the next thing we actually have to do is actually create a bubble. Now, if you recall, up here we went var b gets new bubble, and we use the keyword new to create a new instance from the bubble constructor. We're going to do the same thing here. But when we do that, we actually want to take that new bubble that we've created and return it from this function to the place where the function is called. So we're just going to do a return statement here. Return new bubble. Oops, got to use capital B because it's constructor, and that's the way we wrote it. And now we're going to take these random variables we just created, the x, the y, the r for radius. Again, these are all local variables created inside this create bubble function. So they're different than the x, y, radius, etc. Variables and arguments that we created up above. Their scope is only within this create bubble function. And so they are unique and different than the other ones up above. We're going to use the Vx and the Vy, which we also created right here. And we've just created now a new bubble, and then we're returning that new bubble to the place where we call this function. All right, we're ready to start making a bunch of bubbles, okay? We have the constructor, we have a function that will randomize that location of those bubbles. So let's go back up here to where our variables are created near the top of the scripts, and let's create a few more variables that will control the number of bubbles we make, and we're going to create an array that we can store them all in. So var init bubbles, this would be the original initial number of bubbles. Let's just set that to something like 50. We'll create 50 bubbles to start with. Then we're going to have a min bubbles. And what that means is we never want to have less than this number. We never want to have less than 10 bubbles on the screen at any time. And so when we get to min bubbles, that number 10, then a new bubble will be created. So that's how this program just kind of keeps going forever, just creating new bubbles as we get down to 10. Then we need to create an array that will store all the bubbles. And so we'll just go ahead and call it bubbles plural, and it's not capitalized because it's not a class or constructor. And when we create an array, we have to assign it the value of this empty set of square brackets that signifies that it is an array, and at this point it's just an empty array. Now we also need to create an event listener here, an event that will basically launch this program and get it started. And we want our program to start running immediately when the page loads. So we can go window.add event listener, and in there we will add first the type of event, and that would just be load. And the second argument would be the name of the function that we want to call when this event occurs, and we're going to call it init. Okay, and if you've studied or watched my other video about a game engine, we know that we start with an init function initializing the objects or the drawing elements on our page, and then that function calls draw, and then draw does the drawing, and this kind of creates a very simple game engine that operates as a loop. So inside init, then, we're going to go ahead and create function init here. And inside here, we are going to use we want to fill the bubbles array with bubble objects. I like saying bubble, that's fun. Okay, so we'll use a while loop, and while our bubbles.length, so the length of the array, while that is less than init bubbles, which is what we set to 50 up above, while that's true, we are going to take our bubbles array and use the push method, array method, push a new bubble into the array. Okay, and so again, how do we get a new bubble? Well, we have created a handy dandy function called create bubble down below, which we know gets us a bunch of random values for our new bubble and then returns a brand new bubble. And so when we call that, it will create a bubble, and now we can push that bubble into the array. That's pretty cool. Now, this is kind of complex. So why don't we test this to see if it's actually working? So outside the while loop, after the while loop is done, we should have created our 50 bubbles. Let's go ahead and do a console.log and look at our bubbles array and just see what's in there. Okay, and now if we do this and go back and look, we don't see anything on the screen. Remember, I commented out that test bubble that I made earlier. And the only thing we're doing here is everything we're doing is behind the scenes. We're creating these bubbles, we're putting them into an array, but we haven't actually drawn them yet. But what I'm wanting to do right now with console.log is just take a look at this array. So I pressed F12, opened up the console, and now I see here, oh, wow, there is an array, and it has 50 objects in it. And if I click here, I can now see, let's open this a little bit bigger, we can now see that each bubble object, starting with the number 0, going up to number 49, each object, bubble object, has an X value, so its location on the X-axis, the Y-axis, its radius, and its velocity here on both the Vx and Vy. So it's really nice now we can see that each of these objects has been created. Again, it just hasn't been drawn yet, but they do exist in the memory of this program. Okay, the last thing we need to do now is just draw these 50 bubbles that are on the screen and get them to start moving. As I stated earlier, with the simple game engine that I've created, let's go ahead and console log out this, or comment out this console log. We don't need that anymore. But with our basic game engine, what we do is the init function is called first, which is happening here when we load the page, and then once it initializes the objects, which it has done here in the while loop, we want to call our global draw function. Okay, so we'll just put that in there. Now we haven't actually created that draw function yet, so that's our next step. Let's go ahead down here to the bottom of the page and create a new function called draw. Inside there, we want to first paint the background. Now I put a nice black color on there, so we can do that quite simply by setting the fill style to black, and then do a fill rect, which takes an X, a Y, a width, and a height. Now we want to start from the upper left corner, which is 0, 0 for the X and Y, and then want to go across the full width and height of our canvas, which we set those variables up above. All right, so just doing that alone right there should, if we go back here and look, now give us a canvas that is the full size of the window, the inner width and height of the window, the browser window, and is filled with black. Now there is this area up here that's white, but that's because I put an H1 tag here at the top, and so that's taking up some space, and then the canvas is below that. Okay, so inside the draw function, we're setting up our background. Next, we want to loop through the array and draw the bubbles. Because remember, our array is holding all of those bubbles. So whenever we use an array, we love to use for loops. So we're going to go for var I gets 0, while I is less than bubbles.length. We make I go up by 1, I++. And that's our basic for loop. And in there, and inside our for loop, we want to do is create a variable, I like to call it current bubble. So the current bubble that we're working with, and we are going to get that from the array by going bubbles square bracket I using our counter variable, from the for loop to reference each element in the array. We'll get to store that in current bubble. We want to update the position of this bubble as we draw it. So current bubble dot x plus equals current bubble dot velocity x. So whatever the velocity of this particular bubble is, we want to change its x position by that. And similarly, current bubble dot y plus equals current bubble dot velocity y. And now that we've got the bubble updating its position, we can simply go current bubble dot draw. Again, that's the method built into the bubble constructor that lets us draw the bubble. I just noticed I had an error in my code, and that came from using a comma here instead of a semicolon. So there should be a semicolon there. Let's save this and go back and look at it in the browser. And now we see we have about 50 bubbles drawn all around randomly with random sizes all around our canvas. They're not moving yet, okay, because we haven't yet initiated our loop, our request animation frame loop, but we're going to do that next. Okay, we've just seen that we have our bubbles drawn on the canvas, but we need to get the loop started. So for the loop, we need to go outside of our for loop where we are updating the location of the bubbles and go ahead and call request animation frame. Inside the parentheses will be our callback, which is to the draw function that we're currently inside of. Let's save that and go back to our browser. We see here, if I refresh, we have about 50 bubbles when the animation starts, and they're all moving up in a negative direction towards the top of the screen. They have random sizes. They seem to have random velocities. Some are going faster than others. They're going in different directions, but generally up. And there's about 50 of them when the animation starts. Now, the one thing we haven't done yet is when these are leaving the screen, we want to remove them from the array. We don't want our array to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually slowing down the application. So as they leave the screen, we're actually going to remove them from the array. And then the other thing we're going to do is when our array gets down to having only 10 in it, remember min bubbles, then we will start adding one by one new bubbles back into the array. Let's do that now. To remove and then add back in bubbles, we need to, here inside of our for loop, add an if statement. If the current bubble dot x is greater than the width of the whole canvas, or the current bubble dot x is less than 0, so it's off to the left side of the screen, or it's a long statement here, the current bubble dot y on the y-axis is less than, we'll say less than 10, so it's near the top, then what do we want to do? We want to go bubbles, which is the name of our array, dot splice. Splice will, as it states here, remove old elements from the array, so we can say bubbles.splice. The one we want to splice is the one at position I, which is the one we're currently looking at. The current bubble, remember, is designated by the current counter variable I, and we want to just remove one. Okay. After we've done that, if the bubble array gets too small, meaning we get less than our minimum bubble value, which we gave up above, we want to go ahead and add another bubble to that. So again, we're still inside this one if statement. A nested if statement here is going to be used to add a bubble if array gets too small. Another if statement here would be something like if bubbles.length is less than or equal to min bubbles. Bubbles.splice again at position I, which is our current bubble position. We're going to not remove any. We want to put 0 there, but then we can actually call our function again, create bubble, which returns a bubble, and then we can place it right in that position where the other bubble was just removed. And that's really all we need to do to constantly be removing and then adding in new bubbles as the array gets too small. Let's take a look at this. All right, I'll refresh from the beginning. We have around 50 bubbles. And we can see that they're disappearing, okay? When they get near the top, that's because I set that values when they get beyond 10 pixels from the top. We see them disappearing, so we can kind of test that that's working. And then if we get down to about 10 bubbles, then we start creating new ones. Okay? And again, we're calling create bubbles method, which we know just randomizes the size, location, velocity of the bubble. So sometimes they just pop up right in the middle of the screen, nowhere in particular. So that's it. That's our animated bubbles using plain vanilla JavaScript. No libraries, no add-ons to JavaScript. We're using a game engine, which uses a simple looping mechanism using a request animation frame. And we're just drawing on the canvas. And we're also using objects. So we've got a constructor, which has instance variables and its own methods, draw method. And we're even using an array to keep track of all those objects as we move them around the screen. So I hope this has been helpful. And what you've learned here can really enable you to make some really interesting and fun games. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. And I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video. And that will help me and allow me to continue making this kind of content for people who are interested. Thank you very much. See you next time.